Once again, thank you so much for joining us for our study on sexuality in the Black Church, a womanist perspective by Kelly Brown Douglas. We're now in chapter 3, and it's entitled The Legacy of White Sexual Assault. The Legacy of White Sexual Assault. This chapter seeks to answer these questions by exploring how Black people's responses to their own sexuality and related issues have been affected by white culture's insistence on animalization of them. Black people, according to Kelly Brown Douglas, did not come from Africa as tabuli resi, tabuli resi, Tabuae, racy, Rasae. They came to America possessing a dynamic culture. Now, what does this mean? There isn't a definition for this word. They came to America possessing a dynamic culture. I guess this other word, the word I tried to pronounce, tabule rasi, means not having a dynamic culture. It says that they came to America possessing a dynamic culture. So I guess this word that I could not pronounce means just the opposite. They came without a dynamic culture. They came to America possessing a dynamic culture and an intricate worldview and the delicate patterns of relationships. They utilized this African heritage, though it may have been disrespected in the white world, to carve out a reality and a culture in America that affirmed their humanity. African sexual customs and mores provided the flexibility needed for Black women and men to adjust from a situation of freedom to a situation where someone else had control over their bodies. So in Africa, they were free. Came here, they were enslaved, no longer free. And so, thus, they lost control of their bodies. Reflective of many African cultures from which they came, enslaved women were not ostracized for having engaged in premarital sexual activity or for having children outside of marriage. Neither, of course, were enslaved men. So it was customary to have children outside of marriage. Puberty rites in West Africa, for instance, were either preceded or followed by training of the young in their sexual responsibility. So they were taught of this, they were trained in their sexual responsibility. Some societies concluded puberty rites of young girls with defloration. Defloration is the taking, is defloration is the taking of a woman's virginity. So some societies concluded puberty rites of young girls with defloration, which is the taking of a woman's virginity. The institution of slavery did not respect the sanctity of enslaved marriages. Husband and wives were regularly sold away from one another. They took the husband from the wife. They were married in their country. They were separated when they came here. Husband and wives were regularly sold away from one another, dependent upon the needs or whims of their masters. Wives were not protected from the abuse of white men. In fact, many enslaved men vowed never to get married so they would not have to watch as their wives were insulted, raped, and otherwise being mistreated. Can you only imagine you're married in Africa and you're separated from your wife, and then your wife is raped and you can't do anything about it? Your wife is beaten, mistreated, you're separated from each other. Or if you are in the same plantation, your wife and over there and brought here can be raped right in front of you, mistreated, beaten right in front of you. Notwithstanding the indignities of slavery, the value of marriage was not weakened for the enslaved African. In some instances, they contrived their own rituals, such as jumping over a broom. And I've seen that happen, seen that at weddings, and didn't know that they did that back in Africa to symbolize that they were married. Okay, to mark a relationship of marriage. Most often, however, these couples were bound together only by affection. Christianity also played a regulative role in the enslaved sexual behaviors. Christianity, especially those of women, church membership among the enslaved and former enslaved population seemed to imply management of sexual activity. So Christianity played a regular role. Listen to this. Sexuality played a regular role. Sexuality also played a regular role in the enslaved sexual behavior, especially those of women. Church membership among the enslaved and former enslaved population seemed to imply management of sexual activity. These young women were expected to what? Refrain from premarital intercourse after joining the church, and were greatly censored and castigated if they did not. So these young women were expected to refrain from premarital intercourse after joining the church, and were greatly censored or castigated if they did not. The early Black churches seemed to impose a standard of propriety and fidelity in relation to sexual matters, yet those standards reflected a definite gender bias. The literature of the enslaved says very little about the expectations of the male's sexual behavior once he joined the church. It would be dishonest to suggest that white culture has not impacted Black sexuality. It has in most poignant way. It did just that. What else does it say? It is mandatory. It's mandatory that the Black community initiate a comprehensive form of sexual discourse if it is to repel and disrupt the power of white culture in relation to Black bodies, sensuality, and spirituality. It is mandatory Listen to what the author is saying to us, that the black community initiate a comprehensive form of sexual discourse if it is to repeal and disrupt the power of white culture, that we must develop a sexual discourse if we are to disrupt the power of white culture in relation to black bodies, sensuality, and spirituality. This discourse can be seen as a sexual discourse of resistance. It would not be contrived simply as a counter discourse to that construed by white culture. It would be proactive rather than merely reactive. It would be an intrinsic element of the black culture of resistance. The blues was indeed an important post-emancipation music formed as it allowed emancipated slaves, blues, to give expressions to their freedom in ways that the music of slavery, such as work songs or as spirituals, did not. The blues permitted black men and women to sing about sexuality. The ability to express their sexuality, according to Angela Davis, was an important sign of freedom for ex-slaves. So the blues gave them opportunity to express themselves. Sexuality was one of the most tangible domains in which emancipation was acted upon and through which its meanings were expressed. Sovereignty in sexual matters marked an important divide between life during slavery and life after emancipation. What else? One second here. As shown in the previous chapter, chapter 2, being of the wrong color and gender did what? It caused black women to be uniquely humiliated and violated because they were black. They were considered other than females and hence available for white male rape and debauchery. Also, as also shown in the previous chapter, such humiliation continues for black women as they are still viewed as outside the norm of American female beauty and are treated as what? As Jezebels. Black women are entrapped by a history that has devalued who they are as black women. And I would even argue that today, whites see black females in the same way. If you really look at it closely, nothing has really changed. They continue to wear the scars of a white cultural humiliation that debases their womanhood, even to today. They harbor the pain of someone else's devaluation of their color, hair, their hips, their noses, and basically the way they move, live, and have their being. Without a sexual discourse of resistance, which the author is promoting, the legacy of one woman's pain cannot be confronted. The absence of such discourse means far too many black men and women are left to feel ashamed of their bodies. And I don't believe God would want us to be ashamed of our bodies. They have limited avenues for discovering that the pain, the ambivalence, and or shame they feel are shared experiences generated by a history of exploitation. They've been exploited. From 1985 to 1986, and I remember this, I remember when this happened. I was living in Southeast. I was living not too far. My church was right near this story that I'm about to read. I remember this story when this story was published. In 1985 to 1986, Washington Post journalist Leon Dash conducted a study on Black teenage pregnancy in Anacostia, a section of Washington, D.C., formerly known as Washington Highlands. After living in this community for several months and conducting repeated interviews with a group of teenage girls, Dash released what were then startling findings in a 6-day series in the Washington Post. His findings revealed that nearly 1/4 of the 12, 13, and 14-year-old girls studied wanted to become pregnant. Now, in slavery, young girls 12 and 13 years old was impregnated by their masters. And here you have Black young teenage girls, 12, 13, 14 years old, wanting to become pregnant, wanting to have children. Where did that come from? I would argue that it was embedded long before they were born, and we've covered it in this study. His findings revealed that nearly 1/4 of the 12, 13, and 14-year-old girls studied wanted to become pregnant. As one teenager put it, none of this childbearing is an accident. Recalling his teenage years, a young Black male even admitted that it was important for the adolescent boys to get girls pregnant so that they could feel like a man. Teenage pregnancy continues to be an ever-present concern for the Black community. Though the gap between white and Black teenagers is reported closing, far too many Black teenagers are participating in unsafe sexual activity and hence bearing children. Why is it that teenagers continue to engage in the kind of sexual activity that leads not only to pregnancy, but also to life-threatening diseases such as AIDS? Now, remember, this book was written back in 1999. Why is it so easy for Black teenagers, particularly males, to maim and kill those who look like them? Why do young Black women and men seem to have so little regard for their Black selves that they easily fall prey to crime and drug abuse? Without a doubt, far too many Black youth live in conditions that are life negating. They are trapped in poverty's cycle of indecent housing, substandard schools, lack of health care, inadequate employment opportunities, non-existent recreational options. This means that the struggle to eradicate the systems and structures that breed these social, economic, genocidal conditions must be unrelenting. It also means that Black teenagers must be properly equipped with the tools to strive for life under circumstances that would deny that life. Essential to their striving is an unadulterated self-love. They must be able to love themselves in the midst of a society that disdains their Blackness. In a society where Black people are bombarded by white cultural messages that decry Black sexuality and disparage Blackness, it is not enough for the Black church and community leaders to instruct our children to simply say no to sex, drugs, and other destructive behavior. The Black church and community must engage in a sexual discourse of resistance. that empowers Black women and men to celebrate and to love their Black embodied selves. The demytholizing of Black sexuality is crucial for Black America because much of Black self-hatred and self-contempt has to do with the refusal of many Black Americans to love their own Black bodies, especially their Black noses, their hips, their lips, and their hair. Just as many white Americans view Black sexuality with disgust, so do many Black Americans. It's embedded in some of us. And we still do it today. Still do it today. So, where do we go from here? This strain between female and male is also seen in the social and political realities of Black life. Events like the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill hearings exposed the trust gap between Black men and Black women. Many Black men, for instance, refused to give Hill's charges of sexual harassment any merit. Instead, they saw her as a treacherous, jealous Black woman trying to bring down a Black man. That wasn't true. Another public incident involving a Black woman and a man caused similar reactions after Marion Barry. I remember this incident as well. The District of Columbia's Black mayor at the time was arrested on drug-related charges while in the room of a Black woman who had been employed by the FBI. Many Black men donned t-shirts saying it was that bitch's fault. Excuse me for cursing. A similar attitude was displayed by the National Baptist Convention reaction to Desiree Washington's rape charges against Mike Tyson. The official leadership of the Black denomination supported Tyson while remaining silent about Washington's victimization and vilification. Each of these events, the Thomas hearing, the Barry arrest, and the Tyson case, shows how easy it is for Black men to accept the image of Black women as traitors and Jezebels. Now remember, she's a womanist theologian, so she's going to come at it from this direction. Clearly, there is trouble between Black men and women. While individuals may enjoy healthy, mutual relationships of respect, the Black community remains plagued by antagonism between the sexes. To confront the issue of strained male-female relationships in the Black community would mean acknowledging the presence of sexism within that community. Black men and some Black women refuse to confront this issue and thus relinquish privileges that accrue from gender-based systems and structures. A comprehensive discussion of Black sexuality, she's saying a comprehensive study of Black sexuality, would prompt Black people to face head-on the degree to which their perception of femininity and masculinity have been shaped by the ideology of a white patriarchal culture. Black men's and women's depiction of each other in films and music, as well as their responses to public events, certainly suggests the imprint of white cultural stereotypes. By carefully examining the relationships among sex, race, and power in America, and the way they have been influenced by the sexual politics of white culture. Black people can begin to unravel the messiness of their own intimate relationships. Why have Black manhood, according to the author, and Black freedom so often been linked in the Black community? Why have Black manhood and Black freedom so often been linked in the Black community? Again, this question cannot be adequately addressed until Black people comprehend how white culture has manipulated Black male and female sexuality to such a degree that the acquisition of manhood, according to patriarchal standards, has become a precious commodity for many in the Black community. Again, this makes the need for a sexual discourse of resistance urgent. We need to have this discourse, according to the author. If Black men and women are truly committed to one another, and hence to freedom for the entire Black community, they can no longer avoid penetrating the sexual politics of Black life, especially as they have been infringed upon by the sexual politics of white culture. We need to come together and talk about what has happened and what continues to take place within our community and within ourselves. We need to discuss and come up with solutions to not oppress ourselves. It's enough that we're being oppressed by others, but for us to be oppressive to each other, we need to do something about it. The repercussions of white culture on sexual discourse in the Black community are seen not only on Black self-esteem and male-female relationship, but also on Black spirituality. White culture's sexual exploitation has had a profound effect on Black spirituality and the Black church. Let me repeat that again. White culture's sexual exploitation has had a profound effect on Black spirituality and the Black church. The manner in which Black women are treated in many Black churches reflects the Western Christian tradition's notion of women as evil and its notion of Black women as Jezebels and seducers of men. There are still Black churches that require women to cover their legs. Yes, they do, even today, with a blanket or other forms of a garment or a large I can't think of the name of it, but you know what I mean, covering. There are still Black churches that require women to cover their legs with a blanket when sitting in a pew so they will not distract men. This excuse that Black women are too sexually distracting is also commonly used to keep these women out of the pulpit and ordained ministry. But the mythology of Black women as Jezebels is perhaps most implied in the treatment of unwed mothers. In many Black churches, and I know this to be a fact, unwed mothers are publicly chastised and made to repent in front of the whole congregation, while the fathers are often ignored. I've seen this happen. This humiliating sexist ritual harks back to early Black church expectations that Black women should remain chaste after joining the church, a church that all the while said nothing about sexual conduct of Black men. The double standard is hauntingly reminiscent of the logic used by white men, that's where it came from, who fathered children by Black women during the antebellum and postbellum period. These men were not held accountable. Listen to this, and this is where this came from. For these children, these men were not held accountable for these children who were seen as the sole responsibility of the mother because, according to white logic, it was the seductive, passionate manner of the Black woman that caused the sexual encounter, fathering children by white men, white slave owners. Spirituality involves more than worship or prayer life, or simply going to church. Spirituality concerns a person's connection to God and thus inevitably involves her or his sexuality. So one's sexuality has everything to do with one's spirituality and one's connection with God. Listen to that parallel. I never thought of it this way. This is enlightening. As indicated early in this book, sexuality is that fundamental dimension of human beings, fundamental dimensions of human being, our sexuality, that governs intimate, sensual, affective, emotional, and sexual relationship. Human sexuality and spirituality are intricately linked because both involve a person's relationship to God. That's deep. Think about that. I'm going to pause on that matter and repeat it again. Human sexuality and spirituality are intricately linked because both involve a person's relationship to God. That's heavy. Many African cultures long embraced the intrinsic connection between spirituality and sexuality. We had that connection. We understood that connection all the way back to the motherland. Many African cultures, let me repeat again, long embraced the intrinsic connection between spirituality and one's sexuality. They were connected. This was evidenced by their resistance to dualistic distinctions between the sacred and the secular. They didn't see no difference. We today separate the sacred and the secular. They saw it as being one and the same. The soul and the body. There is no radical break in most African traditions between the spiritual and the fleshly realms. All that is of the earthly realm is God's and it is sacred. So where do we get the differentiation between the two, between the sacred and the secular? Where do we get the differentiation between spirituality and our sexuality and our spirituality? Where did the difference come from? It was embedded in us. It was embedded in us. This is why many African cultures did not view sexual intercourse as bad or evil. We didn't see it as being bad or evil. but celebrated this sacred part of life. It was celebrated in the African culture. In the final analysis, human sexuality makes human relationships possible. Human sexuality makes human relationships possible, including the relationship to the divine. The quality of a person's relationship to God, therefore, hinges in many ways on her or his awareness and appreciation of her own sexuality. Unable to celebrate and appreciate their embodied black selves, Black men and women have often been unable to fully know the image of God that is theirs to bear and to show forth to the world. How, for instance, are we to resolve the contradiction between being created in the image of God and being made to feel that everything about who we are as Black people is inferior? That's an oxymoron. I mean, how can you say that he's listen? Let me repeat this again. Say, how, for instance, are we to resolve the contradiction between being created in the image of God and being made to feel that everything about who we are as Black people is inferior? Such a contradiction typically renders a person incapable of seeing her or himself as a reflection of the divine. Instead, one sees oneself as less than God, or as white culture has intended for Black people to see themselves, as an affront to the image of God. That's how they want us to see ourselves. White culture not only has impeded Black people's ability to embrace themselves, but also has interfered with their ability to know God. In order to resist the discourse of white culture that suggests that Black is bad and contrary to God, Black people must engage in a sexual discourse that maintains the opposite. Such a strategy has the power to foil the goals of white culture. A discourse that resists white culture, she's saying again, talking about this discourse that we need to have. A discourse that resists white culture can encourage and empower Black people to appreciate their own Black bodies and to celebrate every aspect of their Blackness as a gift and a sign of God. In conclusion, this chapter has shown how white culture's sexual characterization and exploitation of Black people has had a far-reaching and deleterious impact on Black lives. This attack has provided a gateway for the condemnation of all of Black sexuality, from Black people's relationship with themselves to their relationship with God. That will conclude our third chapter, and we will pick up next week. I want to thank you for viewing this video. Please subscribe to our channel. Please share with others. Please ask others to view this video or our other videos on our YouTube channel. Please like, please subscribe, please comment. Thank you for chatting live with me when this video was aired. God bless you, and may God keep you. May God bless you, and may God keep you. God bless.